What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? The question lived between her ribs like a small, bright stone. It woke with her. It kept her awake. It was there when she slid her feet into boots that still had yesterday's frost clinging to the seams, and when she pushed open the stable door and the cold air moved like a hand through the empty barn. It was November, the kind of November that makes the light have an opinion about everything it touches. Thin, direct, patient. Morning tasted of hay dust and iron and the faint, almost sweet tang of horse sweat from a week ago. The wind pushed itself along the ridge and carried with it the distant smell of wood smoke from the neighbor's stove. The stable smelled like memory, and something that hadn't yet decided whether it would keep her. She did not have a story to offer about herself. She had a list of small habits that suggested decline. The way she left a teacup unmoved for hours, the careful counting of pills into a palm like they were secrets, the way keys sat at the same point on the counter as if waiting for permission. Her grief was not one big collapse. It was a slow, polite disintegration. It showed up in tiny acts, stacking newspapers by the door, uncoupling the collar of a coat and folding it, leaving the radio on low until it blurred into silence. When the mayor appeared, the world did not change so much as reconfigure around that presence. She was a pinto, broad, irregular patches that looked like someone had taken a brush and decided once to tell a hurried truth. Where the coat was white, the light pooled. Where it was dark, it drank shadow. She moved with the careful deliberation of an animal that has learned the rules of people and chosen not to follow them all at once. Her tail swung like a metronome that had decided to be lazy about the counting. He, the person who'd left, had loved that horse with the narrow, almost fierce affection people reserve for things that answer without asking questions. That love had been handed down to her in sudden grief and a set of tack that smelled like him. She walked the aisle as if she were touching pages of a book still warm from being read. She saw the mare before she heard her. A shape against the ayuatiu, stall wall, a pair of ears, the soft, suspicious blink of eyelids. The mare's breath made the straw rise and fall. A whisker trembled. She felt more than saw the horse's presence. There was the low pressure of another heartbeat against the barn's bones, a small, patient weather of animal existence that made the edges of her loneliness shift. She let her hand hang at her side. Her fingers knew the weight of a halter from 1,000 practiced gestures, but the halter wasn't hers yet. Instead, she breathed. The stable had its own rhythm. The clop of a hoof beyond the pen, the distant drip of thawing ice from the eaves, the soft, habitual chewing of a horse too young to be bored and too ancient to be surprised. The mare turned her head and sniffed the air. Ears rotated like small satellite dishes, catching an undecided signal. Then, as if testing a hypothesis, the mare stepped forward and placed a hoof where the light fell in a cut across the floor. She did not snort. She exhaled through her nostrils like a question mark. Their first meeting was not cinematic in the way movies promise. There was no instant surge of music, no improbable rescue. Instead, there was the exact, honest thing an animal offers first: curiosity without expectation. She moved slowly, the way people do when they do not want to startle something that size. She did not speak. Her voice, if she had one in that moment, would have been too loud. The mare lowered her head. Her nose brushed the sleeve of the jacket the other had left behind. The fabric smelled like old coffee and cedar, and the faint, unmistakable human scent of someone who had often stood where she stood now. The mare's nostrils flared. She made the small horse sound people call a nicker, not loud, more like a throat clearing. A memory unspooled in the woman's chest, the other's hands, calloused and precise, running along a horse's flank with a rhythm she had once mistaken for indifference, but which was actually apology and devotion. She felt the ghost of that touch and tried to fit it into her own fingers. The horse pressed, not the kind of leaning that terrifies, but the kind that asks permission. Her forehead rested against the woman's forearm. The touch was warm and damp with breath, and utterly indifferent to the weight of human history. The mare smelled like late summer, like dust from a far fence line, like a story the wind had been carrying. A sound left the woman, something small and not entirely voluntary. The mare's eyes were large and dark and honest, in a way that made lying unnecessary. There was intelligence there, but it was not the sharp, calculating kind people feared. It was the slow, patient intelligence of an animal that measures all things by their immediate consequence. She watched the woman's mouth for the shape of a smile, and read only the tired muscle under the skin. They learned the measure of each other in something like minutes, and then in something like forever. She scratched the mare's cheek where the salt lines of winter would come. The mare shifted, then sighed. A single ear cocked toward the direction of the lane, a habitual scanning for humans or foxes or trouble. Then she turned that ear back, toward her, as if making a decision about which danger was worth attention. It was not immediate trust. Trust is not a light you flip. It is a slow kind of permission. The mare allowed small things to be patted, to have the blanket adjusted, to be haltered in a way that asked her to move her head, but not her dignity. She accepted carrots with the tiny, precise aggression of the hungry, not the greedy. She did not follow commands she had not been taught. She breathed, and her breath's warmth settled into the woman's wrists like a promise. There were oddities, little behaviors that did not sit comfortably in any neat explanation. Sometimes the mare would pause halfway down the lane and stare toward the old lane that curved through the cattails as if listening to a voice the woman could not hear. Other evenings, when the light was that gray that makes you think twice about the names of things, the mare would paw once and then rest her head against the stall door, eyes half closed, as if remembering something that made her ache, and yet kept her company. The woman watched these things with a kind of tender suspicion. She catalogued them in her head, like someone keeping inventory for a house she was not sure she wanted to keep. Each small peculiarity became a clue. Each clue was dangerous because clues suggest answers, and answers suggested obligations she had not the energy to meet. Still, there were simple miracles in the day-to-day. The mare would stand with the woman's back to her, placing a flank against the hollow between her shoulder blades. On bad mornings, when the house felt like a room she could step out of and never come back, she would find herself under that breath and let herself fall, for a moment, into animal time. The barn clock was not the ticking of a human clock. It was the soft chew of hay, the subtle shift of weight, a tail brushing straw. It allowed her to forget how sharp the edges of grief could be. The mare learned the woman's small rhythms as quickly as the woman learned those of the horse. She came when footsteps sounded the same. She recognized the soft catch in the woman's breathing that came when the name of the other was spoken too loud. She responded to silence as if it required consolation. One evening, when the woman stood, looking at the tack box, and could not bear the sight of the old saddle whose leather had the same groove as his leg, the mare placed her head on the box as if to say, plainly, that things could be held, and that holding did not always mean keeping what was lost. The barn door creaked shut behind them one late afternoon. The light thinned like fabric. She brushed the mare's mane and felt the coarse texture between her fingers, as if each hair were a filament connecting her back to something unfinished. She sat on the hay bale longer than was necessary and traced knots in the rope with her thumb, not because she needed to tie anything, but because her hands needed work. There was a single small question that had nothing to do with how to feed or groom or even how to teach a horse new tricks. It was the kind of question that lives in the throat. What did the mare carry? Not in her stomach or her saddle, but between her ribs. A map, maybe, or a memory, or a hope. The mare's eyes held something plain and terrible. A history that had not yet decided whether it would be revealed. When she stood, the mare lifted her head and took a step that landed with an audible, soft thump. She did not follow at first, but then, as if choosing a companion for a length of road she could not yet name, she drew closer and placed herself by the woman's side. Her warm flank pressed against the woman's shins. The barn smelled suddenly like the beginning of something fragile and dangerous. She didn't know why, but when she turned to leave, the horse followed. She learned the mare's peculiarities the way you learn the language of a house after a storm, by paying attention to the tilt of the floorboards, by listening for which window rattled first. Small things gathered into patterns. The mare's sudden stillness, when a certain squall of wind came from the north. The way she would refuse the left-hand pasture on mornings that smelled of rain. The way she snuffled at a particular corner of the tack trunk until a loose scrap of paper loosened and drifted out like a slow confession. Once, reaching into the trunk for a spare lead rope, the woman's fingers brushed that paper. It was brittle and folded in quarters, edges the color of old bone. The name written on it made her breath snag, as if something had reached across the years to press a hand to her throat. He had written in a hurried, careful hand. Words, half-sentences, things that began as lists and ended as arguments with a sky. There was a line she had read 100 times in the days after he left. Now, with the mare's warm flank against the plank of the trunk, it opened a new door. To the one who finds my mistakes, it said, or something close to that. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. There were instructions about fences, and a map drawn in a shaky circle that included a willow that no longer stood and a house set back under walnut trees. At the bottom, a single word underlined twice. Forgive. Forgive whom? The question lodged like a splinter. The mare tossed her head, and the sound was small and private. She watched the woman read with an eye that suggested the paper was less interesting than the trembling of the hands that held it. Animals notice details that people miss. The cadence of a throat when it tries not to cry. The tremor in a sleeve when someone has arranged their courage and is now unsure whether to wear it. It was not the paper alone that pushed something open. It was the way the mare reacted the next day when the woman folded the scrap and put it in her pocket as if to carry a weight that might be needed later. They walked toward the lane together, the mare's head low and methodical. She paused at the old causeway where reeds curled like sleeping things and planted herself, staring across the thawed water with the intense, odd purpose of an animal waiting for the end of a story. The woman followed the gaze and realized the mare's attention was not random. On a small rise, half swallowed by bramble, stood a rusted tin can. He had once used such cans as markers, to feed the barn kittens, to mark the turn in the lane, to leave a note if he expected to be late. The mare stepped forward, careful, and nosed the grass around it until the tin tipped, and a corner of canvas that had been pushed into the soil unfurled. revealing the corner of a photograph. They had lived with photographs like polite ghosts, on mantle, on fridge, on the inside of boxes. Each one a careful arrangement of life that insisted on being looked at in daylight. This one was different. It was small and weathered. The image showed him leaning against a fence, laughing with his head thrown back, in the kind of way people do when they believe a joke is private and holy. A foal stood at his knee, awkward and luminous. The mare made a soft sound, a throat rumble that could have been recognition or greeting. The photograph shifted something inside her. Grief, which had sat like a steady, polite shadow for months, broke into a dozen edges. It was not an enormous collapse. It was a particular kind of unraveling where the things you'd hidden in drawers fell into the light. She sat down on the teep, rusted gate, and let the photograph fall into her open hands. She did not know whether she was crying because of the image or because the mare had found it. The horse stood with her like an anchor, patient and insolent in its refusal to be less than what it was, a living, breathing presence. That night, she finally spoke his name aloud. A small test. The sound of it made the barn feel more crowded, then empty. She had been saving his name like a coin, keeping it intact for the moments that demanded the currency of truth. When she said it, the mare's ears pricked, and she shifted closer. For the first time in months, the woman allowed herself to admit a thought she'd been denying, that some of what had been lost might be retrieved. Not in the way of returning a thing to its original place, but in the way of relearning how the world fits together with a hole in it. Days collected into a small, deliberate regimen. She followed the faint map in the trunk, visiting the places he had marked with a hand who had known both distance and direction. The mare accompanied her like an insistence on continuity. There were moments of false clarity, where she would think she'd found a neat answer, only to have the mare lift her head and lead her somewhere else entirely. To a low dip in the field where the grass grew coarser, to an old fence post worn by the rhythm of animals, to a place beneath a birch, where the ground smelled like other people's footsteps. The mare's nose would find the smallest trace, and the woman would learn to watch what the horse watched. The revelation did not come as a tidy confession. It came in fragments. An old ledger tucked behind a loose board with numbers that matched. A rent unpaid. A letter unopened that confessed to a careful failure to stay, because staying would mean losing more than oneself. A carved initial, half-eaten by lichen, on the underside of a window that looked out over a kitchen the woman had once imagined herself losing and finding in the same breath. Each discovery rearranged the architecture of her sorrow. Some pieces were explanations. Others were simply more to love and grieve. The mare seemed to understand the cadence of these discoveries. When one detail hurt more than expected, she stayed close and breathed slow as if to pace out the pain. At the lowest point, when the woman found, under a loose floorboard, a box of receipts and stubs that suggested he had been leaving small, secret payments to a place she had never known, the mare did something the woman did not expect. She placed her nose gently against the woman's chest and exhaled. The sound was not human pity. It was an animal's practical comfort. It did not explain. It did not ask for resolve. It simply made presence. That night, grief came like weather. It arrived as rain in the throat, as the sudden jagged knowledge that some truths do not restore what they reveal. She sat in the dark kitchen with the box open on the table, breath shallow like a winter bird's. She wanted to name an enemy. She wanted to find a reason to be done with sorrow. The mare, in the barn, paced once, and then placed her head against the stable door, the way someone leans on a memory for support. The woman stood and walked into the barn without quite deciding to, as if carried by an animal's gravity. They did not speak. Words would have been clumsy. The mare stepped forward and rested her forehead against the woman's chest, as if to anchor her to the body that still existed. The woman sobbed, not the theatrical kind, but the small, corrosive sobs that make the body feel both lighter and raw. The mare's breath was a slow metronome. The horse did not try to fix anything. She simply attended. There is a particular mercy animals offer that humans rarely can. The readiness to sit through another being's pain without imposing a narrative on it. Weeks passed, and with them came a subtle reshaping. The woman stopped pretending that she had a tidy horizon. She began instead to tend the margins of her days. She mended a fence that had sagged and found that the work steadied her hands. She cleaned the tack and discovered small things that made her laugh. A dried clump of something stuck under a girth, the ridiculousness of a bridle tangled like hungry hair. The mare grew calmer, where she had once started each day with a touch of edge. Now there was an ease in the way she stood in the sun. Her coat caught light differently. Her eyes, which had held a particular watchfulness, softened into the long, slow patience of an animal that knows routine. A month became 2, and quiet changes accumulated like coins in a jar until one morning the woman realized she had not woken with the same tightness in her chest she had carried for so long. She still missed him. She still found things that pried open old wounds. But there was also a small space she could call provisional, i.e., room for laughter that had not felt like a theft. The mare led her, quite literally, to a place she had not expected. Following a faint hoof track one afternoon, the mare picked up a scent and veered toward a stand of young maples. There, crumpled and mossing like a secret finally told, was a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a handful of things: a carved pipe, an old ticket stub, a scrap of a map showing a route he had once wanted to travel. There was no grand explanation. There was only the quietness of objects that mean more because someone loved them enough to keep them. She sat with the box in her lap and felt a change. It was not a fix. It was a settling. Grief had not left her life. It had been rearranged into a shape she could live with. She looked at the mare, who was nibbling a leaf as if the moment required nothing more demanding. For the first time in a long time, she felt gratitude that was not edged with accusation. She thought of all the ways people love and leave, and the odd humility of being the one who receives what remains. Sometimes, she realized, closure is not a door that slams shut. It's a window you open to let a different light in. The mare had been, in 1,000 quiet ways, both the map and the compass. She had carried clues hidden in her habits, and led the woman to truths that were both bitter and necessary. When she finally rose and brushed the mare's flank, the horse leaned in and made the small sound of a contented animal. Not triumph, not drama, just the soft punctuation of a life being lived. The woman straightened, breath even. Out on the lane, the IE light had the thin, honest clarity of winter that makes everything precise. She thought of the paper in her pocket, the photograph in her palm, the box under the maples, and the mare at her side. She walked back to the barn with a steady step, the horse matching her pace. There was no grand resolution, only the slow, stubborn work of staying. She had not been saved, and she would not claim to be. But she had been held by an animal with no need for perfection, by someone's careless, unfinished notes, and by the mundane courage to keep returning to the places that hurt. If this whispered story touched you, if it made something in you. Remember the weight and the small mercy of being seen. Subscribe, leave a comment, follow, and press the bell icon so you can be here for the next story that just might change your heart.